Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to take you through certain sections of a book written by our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. It was published back in 2014. The title of it is Common Ground. I want to point out, the sheer hypocrisy, if you will, of what he basically campaigns on and says to Canadians, and illustrate that he does the exact opposite when it comes to the most critical issue for Canada and Canadians, really, that exists, and that is the foundational basis upon which Canada rests. And so, without getting further into it right now, let me just start in. He says that my idea of freedom is that we should protect the rights of people to believe what their conscience dictates, but fight equally hard to protect people from having the beliefs of others imposed upon them. You look at the treaties, it's straightforward to having to hold the key components showing that this is a commercial-based treaty. There is no absolute trade-off or sale or handing over of land, but rather permissions being granted to Her Majesty in order to exercise partial political sovereignty over her people. Instead of being clear about that, Canada, which has happened for decades now, persists under this leadership, persists with trying to convince Indigenous nationals that the doctrine of discovery and its offshoots is the best way to proceed, and that they are nothing more than Canadians, Indigenous Canadians, Indians of Canada, First Nations of Canada, as the various statements go. So, it is critical to stop trying to force feed Indigenous nationals the big myth that Canada continues to try to put in place. And he says, my mother always emphasized the importance of good manners. A breach of protocol or etiquette resulted in a stern rebuke from her. Good manners will open doors for you, she lectured, and once a door is open, you can demonstrate your good character. She also insisted that our attitude toward and interest in other people be genuine. Don't be phony, she said. People can always tell if you're being phony, and when they do, they'll never fully trust you again. I put it to you, Prime Minister, that you have been phony to Indigenous nationals. They thought and believed you that when you said you would do things different, they truly believed that, and they voted for you. And in many areas, secured seats for you as a result. But that trust has been broken because they've come to understand that it's the same old policies, lipstick on a peg. The same old policies that are being used to try to terminate them as nations, to try to get the treaties to fall, so that you, as the Prime Minister, the Chief Privy Council member, could have control over the lands that are currently restricted and limited by virtue of the fact of the treaties. And I'm thinking in particular treaties 1 to 11 right now. He speaks of back in October 1995 when Quebecers were set to vote in the province's second referendum. He says, I remember feeling outraged throughout that campaign at how the yes side used propaganda and demagoguery to try to sell their idea. It seemed to me that they actually didn't understand the seriousness of what they were proposing. If you're going to create a new country, you should have clear support and desire from the population to do it. Conversely, if you're asking Indigenous nationals to give up their country, to give up their nation, to give up the treaties, then they need to understand and fully comprehend the seriousness of that. But instead, The Canadian government under your leadership continues to mislead and continues to assert that the only thing that's possible is you must do that and come under and be part of this new country being formed. They've had their countries for thousands of years. They very willingly will share and work together. But consistently they've said, why should we have to give that up? You have come here, you sought our permissions. We have these treaties. This is supposed to be our way forward. This is supposed to be our foundation. But no, government persists in saying we want more. And he says, given the certain growing pains of any new country, people would have to feel that it was all worth it. And what a possible yes victory seemed to look like, a bare majority mandate based on misinformation, struck me as a recipe for upheaval and unrest. What do you think's going to happen if you do get these deals by misrepresentation, by the secret tables that there's no communication coming out of what you're doing, trying to manipulate a scenario whereby it appears the people have handed their authorities over to a chief, for example, who in turn hands that over to Assembly First Nations, but realizing that doesn't work, you've moved towards putting them at tables by treaty number and hoping that will do it. What do you think's going to happen? It's a recipe, just as you suspected in that example in Quebec. It's a recipe for upheaval and unrest. So by my pointing out the problems with the policies and how you're approaching this and how you're trying to undermine and undo the very foundation that was put in place to secure a mutual successful relationship that did not require conquering, that does not require you to continue to attempt to colonize and conquer at this stage, or conversely get them to abandon because they don't know what that fine print says, because one, they don't truly have independent lawyers that have the capacity to explain what they're really giving up, what these agreements are really about. And secondly, there's no fully informed and freely provided consent. It'd be easy, and I've set that stage by documenting for 30 odd years now how this is wrong, how this is the actions of an outlaw nation. So turning back to Justin Trudeau's comments in his writings, he says Canada is pretty much the only place that defines itself through them. And he's talking about, we have in all his travels, he says Canadian identity is no longer based on ethnic, religious, historical, or geographical grounds. Canadians are of every possible color, culture, creed, and continue to celebrate and revel in our diversity. We have created instead a national identity that is based on shared values such as openness, respect, compassion, justice, equality, and opportunity. Unless, of course, you're one of the original nations, the Indigenous nationals. They're set aside in a separate category, aren't they? That's exactly how your policies are treating them. And he writes, in talking about the difficulties the Liberal Party had incurred regarding scandals, etc., going back into the mid-2000s, he's talking about in 2006 when he supported a certain leadership campaign. He says, the party's basic integrity had been called into question, and I was convinced that the only way to fix that was the old-fashioned way. Look people straight in the eye. Listen to them and tell them the truth. Prime Minister, tell the Indigenous nationals at these tables, tell them the truth. Tell them what those are designed to do. Tell them it's about you wanting to get them to abandon all that they have to remove that foundation that was put in place to assure a mutual, successful relationship. Tell them these are federal policies. And I submit that these policies go contrary to the requirements that bind the Crown. Duty of fairness. What she has done previously, she must continue to do. If there's an attempt to obtain an abandonment, you need the fully informed, freely provided consent of all the nationals, not a part. And I look here and it says, and what that riding, he was speaking of a riding at the time, and world need most are politicians who are focused on bringing people together. Because you insist on pursuing these policies and insist on well-funding them, you are separating, and deliberately as part of that strategy to divide and conquer. That continues today. That's totally different from what you say is needed in order to secure good relations. And he speaks that he's quick to defend minority rights. Well, that's the whole point of the policies that were initiated through his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, to create a domestic ethnic minority of remnants of whose ancestors were viewed under the doctrine of discovery as beasts of the field, less than human, had not progressed enough in their evolution to be seen as full humans with full human rights. It's interesting, his commentary on parliamentary committee work, a group of members of parliament charged with examining legislation or conducting a study within a certain area. He says, members from all parties examine it, hear from experts, witnesses, and interested parties, propose amendments and improvements, and send it back to the House for a final vote. At least that's how it's supposed to work. In my experience, what witnesses say or experts recommend or opposition members propose all matters far less than the optics and the politics that surround a particular issue. He says, most proceedings in committees are sword strokes in a pond, creating only small ripples that disappear quickly. So when Indigenous nationals have proposed solutions and reminded of obligations of the Crown and reminded your government in terms of its responsibilities, those seem to have fallen on deaf ears. And this explains why. He tells a story about how he got his raven tattoo. He says, I'm not telling you this story to romanticize First Nations. I have spent too much time in too many remote reserve communities to be anything but clear-eyed about the challenges many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people face. My gesture was as much about the future as it was about that past event. It is a reminder of a fundamental fact of Canadian life. We have failed to achieve a respectful, functioning relationship with First Nations. This is one of Canada's greatest unresolved questions. Why? Why? He says, so many of these problems, significant progress has eluded most of our prime ministers because they continue along that same termination path. They ignore the treaties. They ignore the fact of sovereign Indigenous nations. They ignore the foundation that's necessary to move forward. That's why we're continuing to visit this same stuff over and over again, and we continue out of the public purse in terms of funding all this stuff. If even 10% of everything that's been put into trying to manipulate and set up negotiations to achieve the appearance of abandonment, if only 10% had been put into addressing real needs, housing, education, health, the fundamentals, the requirement of the Crown to not only meet the treaty responsibilities, but also because Canada deemed Indigenous nationals to also be Canadian citizens, to also provide them with the same standards that other Canadians then enjoy, whether it's in a city or not. Those standards have been artificially manipulated. That ceiling of 2% funding increase, has that ever been removed? No. I believe you campaigned on that before, but it hasn't been removed. And you said that First Nation communities across Canada have a right to a fair and real chance at success. Their success is based on the fact of their being owners and being that highest rung of law under which Canada, and on the basis upon which Canada can proceed to grow. And those fundamental Indigenous laws, sharing, caring, love, those are the fundamentals. That's where the success will lie, in truly coming to understand that the position that has come out of Canada, Canadian governments and civil servant, that you try to get people to accept that these treaties were a sale of land, when any lawyer with any familiarity with property law, for example, understands when they see to have and to hold that that's simply not true. That when Indigenous nationals, ancestors, elders now have expressed, we didn't sell the land, you know darn well they're telling the truth, but still you persist. And as a result, you have orchestrated poverty, dependency, all in hopes of putting them into, forcing them again into a situation of desperation whereby they will see that your incentives are the only thing that they could possibly hope for. It's my effort and my intention to challenge that and to point out the truth, the legal truth of matters. It says, for example, Canada's prosperity depends on our ability to develop our natural resources and get them to world markets. Well, do you understand, do you realize, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, that under the treaties, and I'm thinking now Treaty 1 to 11, for example, that third parties cannot come in and take away land. You can't have an open pit mine and have land removed. The Crown and her Canadian governments and her Crown corporations have abilities under treaty to do certain things. It doesn't come without a cost, but they have the right to do certain things. You cannot, there is no proviso for assigns in those treaties. You'll not see that word there. There is no assigning that right to third parties, parties that are not part of the treaties and cannot be, because companies don't enter into treaties. These companies that have done all these things, relying on your misrepresentations, Canadian governments, to think they're actually getting assets. And in fact, what they've been doing is loading up liabilities. Because all of that's been done, they never got the permissions they needed to get from the owners. Canada, you got permissions for yourself, not for others to come in and do what they've been allowed to do. The Indigenous nationals did not allow that. The Indigenous nations didn't allow that. You allowed that. So the fact of the matter is, this could get very, very economically messy and ugly until such time as you start to proceed on the proper path. You speak that, Justin Trudeau speaks that the Canadian Constitution defines the common ground upon which we agree to build this country together. Well, remember, that's your constitution. Indigenous nationals' constitutions have been in existence for thousands of years. They've had to adapt to different situations, including horrendous environmental events, but they were never put under your receiving of self-government, delegated self-government from the Crown. There's reference to Indians and lands reserved for Indians as a matter of the federal government taking the responsibility in relation to, in other words, to conduct the diplomacy. But instead, because you're treating Indigenous nationals as domestic ethnic minorities, you're trying to pass off a lot of that to provinces and territory, Northwest Territories, for example. And he points out, after becoming a father, I gained a deeper, more concrete appreciation for why it is so important to work hard to hand to our kids a stronger country than the one we inherited from our parents. What do you think Indigenous nationals feel? Exactly the same thing. Their laws require it. Their laws require them to consider future generations. And yet you feel that while this is fine for you and yours, that it shouldn't apply for Indigenous nationals. They do not need to, nor do they want to give up their country. They do not want to give up what they are responsible for, and they want to as well provide for their own. This is why there are treaties in place, to ensure just that. But instead you want them to walk away from who they are and give up, as a result, what's been put in place to protect them. And I might add, to protect Canadians as a whole. Justin Trudeau says we would try to overwhelm the politics of fear and negativity with a new kind of politics, one that sought to bring people together to build on common ground, rather than divide them into camps and exploit their differences for our political gain. The whole premise of policy towards Indigenous nationals is based on fear and negativity. Don't do this, you won't get something. Do this, we'll give you this. And as a result, that effort, and it's intentional, I put it to you, it's intentional, it's no accident. This divides Indigenous nationals into different groups and camps. They're acting on the basis of fear. There is a common ground. It exists. The ancestors put it there. Your ancestors put it there. And that is the common ground of the treaties. There's nothing to be fearful of those treaties. They're there for a reason. It's upon that basis that Canada can create its foundation in terms of its own governance, and to step out of and stop interfering with the continuing nations and their governance. So again, the commitment to leave to our children a better country than we inherited from our parents. So he makes that point a couple of times. Now, this is interesting. I can't help but think of the blackface event when I read this. He's speaking about the National Energy Program. He says, the National Energy Program and its fallout is a reminder that the representative nature of politics borders on tribal at a certain level. I don't mean this in a pejorative sense at all, not mean this in a negative way. Well, then what exactly do you mean? Why are you using this term tribal? I find that so offensive. And this is in 2014 that this is published. Much, you know, your blackface event was much earlier. This says to me that your attitude towards the governance that Indigenous nations have survived under for thousands of years, you find distasteful. He speaks of a situation where he was talking to 20,000 young Muslim Canadians. They came together to talk with one another about how they could be full participants in a pluralistic, multicultural society like Canada without losing what was remarkable and unique about their religious beliefs and cultural life. My message was straightforward. I could think of no more fundamentally Canadian discussion than that one. How to become genuine citizens of Canada without turning our backs on our communities of origin is a struggle that most Canadians have faced throughout history. And he says we can go down the path our ancestral countries and cultures have walked, rancor, conflict, and violence, or we can try to figure out a new, more productive and generous way to live together. Now remember, Indigenous nationals didn't come from somewhere else. This is their land. This is their beliefs, their laws, everything, all their relations is all focused and connected to the land. And yet, the extreme effort that Canadian governments go to, the amount of money they spend in trying to disconnect them from their land, it's not necessary. It is, it stems back to doctrine of discovery. We're well past that in terms of our view of people. Indigenous nationals are fully human. Just because their systems of law and governance differed from yours doesn't make them any lesser entitled to what they continue to hold. All of this was anticipated, hence the treaties, right? This is to avoid conflict. Her Majesty, the Crown, decided not to go to war, to engage and continue to engage in that peaceful commercial approach of partnership and earning money together and being part of an economic system together. And he references Wilfrid Laurier to say that he laid down his trump card. We are all here and none of us are going anywhere. Well, if you will recall, when Antonio Lemaire is then Supreme Justice Supreme Court of Canada, he used that line. And as I've outlined before, our court system in Canada is part of the government. So here you have a key quotable line originating from the Liberal Party, making its way into the reasons and decision-making of a Liberal appointed justice. And I've done a separate issue on the background of the Section 35 doctrine that I encourage you to review. So I last have two comments from a speech that Justin Trudeau gave, the speech announcing bid for the Liberal Party of Canada leadership, and this occurred in Montreal on October 2, 2012. The old-fashioned idea of progress, the idea that we owe a sacred duty to Canadians who come after us to work hard to build a country that offers them even more than we had. More opportunity, more choices, more success, just as our parents and grandparents did for us. A reminder, Indigenous nations already have a built country. Under their laws, the law of the land, they decided to share and entered into treaties granting permissions to Her Majesty to exercise partial political sovereignty. And as Canada tries to build upon its self-government exercise, Canada has no right to insist upon the destruction of those countries, of the country already built. That's called war, and that's called the actions against the peace, and that is the fundamental problem and why Canada is indeed an outlaw nation. And he separates out, First Nations from foreign policy. He says, and directly to our First Nations, that possessory. The Canadian reality has not been and continues to not be easy for you. We need to become a country that has the courage to own up to its mistakes and fix them together, people to people. Your place is not on the margins. It is at the very heart of who we are and what we are yet to become. Precisely the Indigenous nations, it's upon the foundation of their permissions that they've granted to the Crown that Canada's even here and even has the right to build upon its exercise of self-government. Of course, Indigenous nationals are not on the margins, but federal policy and provincial policy have persisted in treating them as if they are mere domestic ethnic minorities. And you continue to try to get them to sign into agreements that admit that will say we never were, because under the Section 35 doctrine, for example, we never were nations. We actually were, descended from beasts of the field. We weren't progressed enough. We didn't have the ability to establish governance and things like that. We just kind of roamed around. There's nothing further from the truth. So yes, own up to the mistakes. Let's take a different course. Let's do it right. Let's build upon the strong foundation. Because otherwise, what you're doing is simply putting off some of what we're seeing in the States today. It is going to be possible to put Indigenous nationals down. You may temporarily achieve some short-term quiet, but I can guarantee you that over the long term, because there is no binding legal foundation for what you're trying to do, even if you get the signed agreements, even if you say, here's all our evidence, well, I can assure you that the Indigenous nations are producing and gathering and collecting their own evidence. So in the future, there will be an ability to respond, to say, no, in this time frame, they did not abandon. They remain Indigenous nationals. The Canadian governments had no lawful ability to insist upon manipulation in order to coerce an abandonment that was never understood to be what they were doing. Why? Because they were led to believe it was something else, because you did not stand up, look them in the eye, and tell them the truth. Well, I'm telling them the truth, and that's all I have to say.